Good evening from Studio 11B in Rockefeller Center. I'm Linda Walters, and this is Channel 7 Eyewitness News. Here's a look at what we're following tonight. We'll have a preview of tomorrow's American League Championship Series matchup as the Yankees face the Angels. First pitch is set tomorrow for just after 8. We'll break down what fans can expect heading into a pivotal game in the series. Plus, a developing story out of Midtown tonight, where residents in a large apartment complex were briefly evacuated this afternoon due to what officials described as a structural concern. Tenants were allowed back inside after inspectors cleared the building, though some residents reported lingering issues with lighting and interior spaces. We'll tell you what management is saying and what residents say they noticed before they were told to leave. And later, a look at tonight's weather and what could be a colder than usual October evening settling in across
the city. My name is Jacob Gordon. I was in high school for 9/11. It's hard to understate the effect it had on what most of us did after graduation. It's something that I feel gets lost as time moves on. I knew guys who enlisted as soon as they could, and some guys who went the ROTC route in college. Some of them came back and some didn't. I never got to hear most of their stories either way. There was this pull inside of me that felt different. Like whatever I was supposed to do needed to happen here, at home. It needed to be about protecting what was ours from the inside. I guess that's why I ended up at the Bureau. After college and a few years of cutting my teeth in Baltimore, I finally got the transfer I'd been chasing. I was moved to New York, working out of the Javits building. It should have been perfect. It was exactly what I imagined when I signed up. Except I wasn't doing what I thought I'd be doing. They had me surveying a religious group that had been operating somewhere in the city. The file they gave me was thin. It contained a handful of missing person reports with tenuous connections at best. It was the kind of work that felt insignificant compared to what I'd signed up for. The group hardly seemed worthy of being on the Bureau's radar. I spent those 3 years in Baltimore working sleeper cell research, tracking financial networks and communication patterns across half a dozen cities. I knew the names that mattered. I'd never heard of anything called the Last Assembly. The only other thing in the file was what I could only describe as their Bible, though it really wasn't anything like that. The cover just said documentation in plain black letters. I read through it several times trying to find something useful. It wasn't scripture or even philosophy. It read like instructions. There were step-by-step procedures for doing things I couldn't understand the purpose of. Diagrams of circles and positioning. Lists of what they called necessary elements that made no sense together. For months, I tried working out how I could get reassigned to something that mattered. I drafted transfer requests I never sent. I even looked into a lateral move to another field office where real work was happening. Despite this, I did what I could with what I had. The missing persons files gave me names and last known addresses. I ran credit checks and phone records. I walked door to door in neighborhoods from Queens to the Bronx, asking questions that led nowhere. People would shake their heads or close their doors or look at me like I was wasting their time. I was starting to think that they were right. That was until October 2nd, 2009, when a man named Leonard Lenoci wanted to talk about the Last Assembly. He'd gone to the police first, but someone had the sense to put him on to me. Leonard claimed he'd been part of the Last Assembly and had important information he was willing to share about the group. I set up a meeting at a diner on 47th Street for that afternoon. I got there early and sat at the booth near the back where I could watch the door. The spoon on my plate would click whenever the F train rumbled through the tiles below, and the October air kept slipping in whenever the door would open. I pulled Leonard's files before the meeting and read through them while I waited. He was a former engineer who'd lost his job at a firm in Midtown about 4 years back. He had 3 arrests for drunk and disorderly between 2006 and 2008. 1 DUI that got pled down, and some court-mandated AA meetings that had apparently stuck because the last arrest was over a year ago. Groups like the one I suspected the last assembly to be didn't go after people who had their lives together. They went after the ones who were already broken and looking for something to fill the hole. Leonard would have been perfect for them. He showed up at exactly 2 o'clock like we'd agreed. I watched him through the window before he came inside. He was a tall guy, maybe 6'2", with medium-length brown hair slicked back from his face. The hair looked greasy even from a distance. His whole appearance had that quality to it, like he'd been sweating through his clothes all morning. I went through the standard precautions with him first. I explained that if he was going to work as a confidential informant, that there was risks involved. I told him the Bureau would do what it could to protect his identity, but we couldn't guarantee anything if things went sideways. I told him he couldn't be involved in any criminal activity while working with me, or the whole arrangement was a no-go. He nodded through all of it without really looking at me, and I wasn't sure how much of it was getting through to him. When I asked him how he got involved, Leonard finally looked up at me. He said it was at AA. A woman started showing up to his meetings about 8 months back. She was young and attractive, and she paid attention to him when nobody else did. He said it straight like that, no shame in admitting what had worked on him. She talked to him after meetings and eventually invited him to come hear about something that had helped her find real purpose. He knew what she was doing even then, but he went anyway because he wanted to see her again. The first few meetings weren't what he expected. They didn't talk about God or salvation or any of the usual things. They talked about reality and perception and how most people sleepwalk through their lives without understanding what's actually happening around them. He said they made him feel like he was finally waking up to something important, like he'd chosen to see what others couldn't. Leonard spent the next few minutes telling me how the group had genuinely helped him in ways that AA never did. He said they gave him structure and purpose and a reason to stay sober that felt bigger than himself. He described meditation exercises and group discussions that made him feel centered for the first time in years. He said it honestly, without irony, that for those first few months, he didn't see anything wrong with what they were doing. "So what changed?" I asked. Leonard's fingers drummed against the table. "About 2 months ago, they moved me into a smaller group, said I was ready for more responsibility." He paused and wiped his palm across his forehead. "They had us recruiting homeless people. We'd go out to the shelters and soup kitchens and offer them a place to stay, hot meals, tell them we could get them help and back on their feet." "And did you?" I asked. "For a little while, yeah. We'd bring them to a couple meetings and then they'd just stop showing up. I figured they were just not interested or went back to the streets. But then last week I heard someone mention that homeless people weren't working anymore. Those exact words, weren't working." I asked him what he meant by that, what they were doing with these people that wasn't working anymore. Leonard shook his head. "I don't know. I really don't. I was never bought into that aspect of it. But I heard someone say they make them disappear. At least that's what they told me. They make them disappear, but I was too afraid to ask what the hell that meant." I wrote it down in my notebook even though I wasn't sure what to make of any of it. The phrase felt theatrical and something you'd hear in a bad movie. "And they stopped recruiting homeless people after that?" I asked. "Yeah, about 2 weeks ago. Just stopped completely." He looked past me towards the window where the October wind was pushing leaves against the glass. "I think whatever they were doing with them just stopped working, I guess." The rhetoric was starting to feel a little far-fetched. I decided not to entertain his last statement and instead reached into my jacket and pulled out a folder with the missing persons photos. 4 of them in total. I laid them out on the table between us, one by one. "Have you seen any of these people?" I asked. Leonard leaned forward and studied each photo carefully. He picked up a couple and held them closer to his face. "No," he said finally. "I don't recognize any of them." I took a deep breath and pinched the bridge of my nose. The fluorescent light above our booth was starting to give me a headache. I thought about Mike Castellano, who I'd known since freshman year. Last I'd heard, he was in Kandahar doing something that actually mattered. Or Danny Reeves, who had made sergeant in the Marines after 2 tours. They were doing real work that meant something. And there I was, sitting in a diner booth, talking nonsense with some former drunk about homeless people disappearing. Leonard must have sensed this because he leaned forward suddenly, forcing his greasy hair to fall across his forehead. "You need to understand what this group truly believes," he said. His voice had gotten urgent in a way that it hadn't been before. "They really think that they are responsible for keeping evil at bay from the earth. They believe that without them, the world would be overrun. They think that they're the only thing standing between us and the end of everything." He adjusted his position in the booth. "They actually believe that." "Okay, how about some names then? Can you give me any names so I can start tracking these people?" Leonard hesitated and stuttered. We don't really use our real names. I'm not even sure why, but it's one of the first things that they tell us when we join." I raised my eyebrows and rubbed my eyes, trying not to look painfully unsurprised. Eventually, I pulled the documentation from my folder. The black letters on the cover stared back at me like they always did. I flipped it open to a random page with one of those diagrams. There was a section that seemed to depict a dark closet that I'd somehow never seen before. "Where in here does it say any of that?" I asked, pointing down to it. Leonard took a nervous breath and shook his head. "It doesn't." I felt my jaw tighten. "Then where are you getting this from?" Leonard waited longer than he needed to for a waiter to walk by before continuing. "They don't start talking like that until you've been there for a while. Until they trust you. The documentation is just procedures or instructions. But once you're in deep enough, they'll tell you what it's actually for." I tapped the documentation with my finger. "So you know what all this means?" Leonard hesitated again. His eyes moved across the diagrams on the page like he was trying to read something that wasn't there. "No," he said finally, "I don't." I could feel the frustration building behind my eyes where the headache had started. "But people have been telling you things recently, right?" "Yes, more recently," he replied. I closed the documentation and put it back into the folder. I looked at Leonard sitting across from me and tried to keep my voice level. "So this is really what you came here to tell me? That you've been part of a group that's been making homeless people disappear?" Leonard's expression changed. Something pleading came into his eyes. "No," he said urgently. "No, that's not why I came." His eyes darted towards the window again. "There's panic," he said. "Real panic. People are scared." I waited for him to continue. "Some of the members think it's too late, that whatever they've been doing isn't enough anymore. But others," he trailed off for a moment, "others think that they need to start using more prominent people." I looked at Leonard confused. "Using them for what?" "I don't know." His voice cracked slightly. "I really don't know what it means, but I've heard the phrase more prominent more than once." I wrote it down in my notebook. The words looked meaningless on the page. "And that's why you came to me," I said. Leonard nodded. "I don't want to be a part of whatever that means, but I'm scared to leave or stop showing up. They know where I live." I winced. "What do you expect me to do with this?" I asked. "You're giving me nothing. Vague phrases about prominent people and panic and things not working anymore." Leonard's face went pale. He opened his mouth, but I didn't let him respond. "I need names," I said. "Real names of people involved, addresses, meeting locations. I need proof of illegal activity, something I can actually use." I closed my notebook and slid it back into my jacket. "Right now, all I have is you telling me about rumors and overheard conversations from a group you claim to be a part of, but can't tell me anything concrete about." Outside, the wind rattled against the window again. I can't just walk into my supervisor's office and tell him a religious group is talking about using prominent people for something you don't understand, I continued. That's not how this works. Leonard stared down at the table. He looked smaller somehow. If you want protection, if you want me to actually do something, you need to give me more than this. I stood up from the booth and felt my frustration melt into pity for Leonard. I reached into my jacket and pulled out one of my cards and slid it across the table. Contact me when you know something more, I said. Leonard looked down at the card but didn't pick it up. And don't do anything stupid in the meantime.
Breaking news out of Manhattan tonight. 23-year-old Natalie Phillips, daughter of tech executive Morgan Phillips, has been reported missing. According to the NYPD, Natalie was last seen in the lobby of her father's penthouse building on the Upper East Side early yesterday morning, around 3:15 a.m. Security footage shows her leaving the building alone, but investigators say she never returned home and has not been heard from since. Her cell phone has been turned off, and her credit cards have not been used. Morgan Phillips, CEO of Phillips Technologies, released a statement earlier this evening pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The family is offering a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return. Police are asking anyone who may have seen Natalie or has any information about her whereabouts to contact the NYPD immediately. She is described as 5'6", approximately 120 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. She was last seen wearing a gray sweater.
On October 12th, every local agent in the Javits building was called for a briefing on Natalie Phillips, the missing daughter of CEO Morgan Phillips. The conference room was packed shoulder to shoulder with agents from every department. I stood near the back while the special agent in charge, Lawrence Roman, ran through the details we already knew from the news. The family was offering a 6-figure reward. They wanted every available resource on this immediately. Roman kept emphasizing that agents working Islamic terror surveillance should prioritize any leads they had, convinced that this would connect to some kind of plot. They were already building frameworks around potential extremist cells and kidnapping for ransom scenarios. My phone buzzed twice during the briefing, but I ignored it. Roman was still running through the timelines of potential leads when it buzzed a third time. I slipped out the back of the conference room into the hallway. It was Leonard who answered. They took her, he said. They took Natalie Phillips. I double-checked that there was no one else in the hallway before I responded. How do you know that? I heard them talking about it this morning. I think they're holding her in a warehouse in Chelsea. He gave me the cross streets, West 25th near 11th Avenue. He said it was an old industrial building they'd been using for the past month. I asked him if he'd seen her there himself, and there was a pause on the other end that lasted too long. No, he said finally. I told him to give me a percentage. I needed him to tell me exactly how confident he was that she was actually going to be in that warehouse. Because if I was going to make a serious case to get a warrant to go into that building, I wanted to make sure she was going to be there. There was silence on the other end. I could hear his breathing getting faster. Leonard, I said, give me a number. I don't know, he said finally. 70, maybe 80? You don't know, or you're guessing? Another pause. I'm pretty sure. I heard them say her name, and they mentioned the warehouse on 25th. I lowered my voice to a whisper. I want you to tell me you saw her." "Why does that matter?" Leonard asked. "Because no one else but me even knows what the last assembly is," I said. I kept my voice low because I could hear footsteps coming down the hall from the conference room. If I go up the chain with a 70% chance from some new informant, then nothing is going to happen. They're going to tell me to develop better intelligence first. They're going to tell me to wait. Morgan Phillips' daughter is missing. Every agent in this building just got pulled into a briefing about Islamic extremists and ransom scenarios. You think anyone's going to authorize a warrant based on overheard conversations about a religious group no one's ever heard of? The footsteps were getting closer. I turned towards the wall and lowered my voice even more. "I need you to tell me you saw her, Leonard. That's the only way this works." There was silence on the other end for what felt like forever. I could hear Leonard breathing and somewhere behind him the sound of traffic. "I saw her," he said finally. His voice was barely audible. "I saw Natalie Phillips at the warehouse. She was there." The lie hung between us like something physical. I crossed a line I'd never crossed before, and I knew it. "You better be right about this," I said quietly. I walked to my supervisor's office an hour later with everything I had. He wanted to know why he'd never heard of this group before. I should have been asking him that, since I was only one of 10 agents that reported to him. But instead, I told him the last assembly operated underground, that they'd been careful, that my informant had only recently gained enough trust to access this kind of information. He asked me how much I trusted my informant, and I told him completely, which was more than half a lie. Luckily, the desperation of the situation worked in my favor. Every hour that passed without finding Morgan Phillips' daughter meant more pressure from above, more media scrutiny, and more political heat. My supervisor made 3 phone calls while I stood there. I felt like a child asking my parents if my friend could sleep over, but within 90 minutes, I had a warrant for a warehouse on West 25th. I reported to a precinct station near Chelsea, which was unmarked. It was the kind of place you'd walk by without noticing. I expected to find a SWAT team geared up and ready when I arrived. Instead, I found a duty station attendant sitting by himself behind bulletproof glass. He barely looked up when I showed him my badge. He said the team was out running 2 priority operations. He pointed to a bench along the wall and told me to wait. I sat there for 2 hours watching the clock above the attendant's desk tick forward. Every 15 minutes I'd ask if there was an update, and he'd shake his head without looking away from his newspaper. The SWAT team finally came back at 5:15. I gave the team leader a quick rundown of what little I knew. A religious group, possible kidnapping victim, warehouse space they'd been using for meetings. He nodded without much interest and told his guys to gear up. Within 15 minutes, we were loaded into a van heading towards West 25th Street as the October sun dropped behind the buildings. The warehouse wasn't really a warehouse at all. It was more like an office space with a large storage area attached. It was the kind of building that could have housed a small startup or a photography studio. The team cleared the entire building in less than 30 seconds. When they finished, there were only 3 people sitting on folding chairs near the back wall. 2 women and 1 man. None of them were Natalie Phillips. I searched every room myself after the team finished. There was nothing. No evidence of anyone being held against their will. No signs of struggle or confinement. The filing cabinet was completely empty except for some unopened office supplies. The only thing unusual was in the main storage area. Someone had drawn a large chalk circle in the center of the concrete floor. Inside, the circle sat a single metal folding chair facing towards the windows. 2 local NYPD officers arrived about 10 minutes later. I told the SWAT team that they could pack up and head out. They didn't need to be told twice. Within 5 minutes, the van was pulling away from the curb, and I was left standing in the warehouse with 2 uniformed police and 3 people who wouldn't look at me. I pulled one of the women into the small office space near the front of the building and had the officers watch the other two. The woman was maybe early 30s with long dark hair that hung past her shoulders. I asked her plainly if she was part of the last assembly. She didn't respond. She just stared down at the concrete floor like there was something written there only she could read. "Where is Natalie Phillips?" I asked. The woman didn't move for a long moment. Then she started shaking her head slowly back and forth, her shoulders hunched forward. "It didn't even work," she said quietly, more to herself than me. I pulled up a chair and sat down close enough to where our knees were almost touching. "What didn't work?" I said. "What were you guys doing here?" She looked up at me, and for the first time I could see she was actually processing the situation. Her eyes moved across my face like she was trying to understand how I'd gotten there, or why I was asking these questions. But she didn't say anything. I felt frustration rising in my chest. I'd fabricated evidence to get a warrant based on a lie from an informant I barely trusted. We'd raided a building and found nothing. No kidnapping victim, no crime, just 3 people sitting in folding chairs and a chalk circle in the floor. But I knew I didn't have many cards to play. I couldn't hold these people if they wanted to leave. There was no evidence of anything illegal, no probable cause. There was certainly nothing that would justify arresting them. "All right," I said, letting myself cool off for a second. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the documentation. The black letters on the cover almost looked mocking in the fluorescent light of the office. I flipped it open to a random page. I held it up so she could see it clearly. "What does this mean?" I asked. The woman's eyes moved to the page, and then something changed in her expression. She stared at the diagram for a long moment without saying anything. The woman took a shaky breath while her eyes stayed fixed on the diagram. "These are the steps to appease them," she said. I waited for her to continue, but she just kept staring at the page. "Appease who?" I asked. She shook her head slowly. "It doesn't work anymore. Or maybe we got the requirements wrong. I don't know which." I set the documentation down on the chair between us and leaned forward so she had to look at me instead of the page. "I need you to explain what you're saying to me like I'm 5 years old," I said slowly. "Pretend I don't know anything about any of this." The woman leaned back in her chair and her eyes went somewhere else for a moment before coming back to me. In that moment, she looked jealous of my ignorance. "There's one here with us right now," she said quietly. "What's here with us?" She lifted a hand and pointed past my shoulder, towards the back corner of the office where a corner closet stood. I turned and looked at the closet door. I remembered watching SWAT clear it earlier when they'd swept through the building. One of them had yanked it open, shined his flashlight inside for maybe 2 seconds, and then moved on to the next room. "There's something in that closet," I asked, but she didn't offer an explanation. I stood up from my chair and walked towards it. The woman stayed seated. I took a long look at her before I reached for the handle. The metal was cold against my palm as I pulled the door open. Inside the closet looked deeper than it should have been. The space stretched back farther than the dimensions of the office should have allowed. I couldn't find a light switch anymore along the interior wall. My hand moved across the painted drywall and felt cold and slightly damp. I stared into the darkness for a long moment. The edges seemed to pull away from me the longer I looked. I thought I could see what looked very much like a large hooded sweatshirt hanging in the center. Then, for just a second, I thought I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me, somewhere deep inside the hooded shape. I took a huge step backwards. My hand went instinctively to my belt, where I kept a small flashlight. I clicked it on and aimed the beam into the closet. The light added a new perspective to the space, which made it seem much smaller, maybe 3 feet deep. The walls were closer than they'd seemed a moment before. Then there was a couple wire hangers pushed to one side and an old cardboard box on the floor I hadn't seen. Nothing else. I turned back towards the woman. She was standing now. Her dark hair hung across her shoulders and her eyes were fixed on me. She looked at me like I'd just been let in on a secret. The woman turned and walked towards the door without saying anything else. I started to call after her, but felt my eyes pulled back to the closet. Its depths seemed endless again, where the beam from my flashlight that had shown me wire hangers and cardboard seconds earlier now revealed nothing but darkness, stretching back impossibly far. I allowed myself to follow my primal instincts and reached forward to push the door shut. The latch clicked softly in the quiet office. I stood there for a moment with my hand still on the handle. Behind me, I could hear the woman's footsteps moving away down the hallway. I turned and followed her out. I met Leonard the next day at Penn Station, where the October cold had seeped into the concourse, and the Tuesday night crowds pushed past us towards their trains. He was waiting near one of the tall windows in the corner, looking thinner than I remembered. When he saw me approaching, he shifted his weight like a cornered animal that had nowhere to go. I skipped any formalities and asked him why Natalie Phillips wasn't at the warehouse. He just shook his head, looking past my shoulder at the departure boards. "You were probably too late," he said quietly. His voice barely carried over the announcement system, calling out track numbers and destinations. "By the time you got there, they'd probably finished with her, or whatever they do." I stepped closer, so he had to look at me. "Finished with her?" Leonard's eyes met mine just for a second before dropping back to the floor. "I'm leaving," he said. "I've got family in Baltimore, cousins who might let me stay with them for a while." "You're running?" I asked. "Yeah." He said it without shame. "I told you what I knew, and you raided the warehouse, so now they know someone talked. You think I'm sticking around for that?" The departure board clicked and updated behind us. Leonard glanced at it nervously. I started asking where they might be keeping the girl now, who else I could reach out to about it, but Leonard cut me off. "It's too late for that," he said flatly. "There are bigger things at play now." I grimaced and looked behind me at the crowd streaming past. When I turned back, Leonard was staring at me with some level of awareness of how crazy he was sounding. "The group is split," he said, "at least with the people I've been around. One group thinks it's simply too late, that whatever we were doing no longer works and now there's nothing left to do." He adjusted his oversized backpack that was causing him to hunch forward. "Most of those people have just walked away, abandoned the whole thing." I reluctantly entertained Leonard's thought. "And the other group?" Leonard looked down at his shoes. "The others are trying to interpret the documentation again. They think they've got something wrong about the requirements. From what I can tell, they think there needs to be witnesses for what they're doing. But I can't be sure that's really what they mean." I stared into Leonard's eyes, trying to judge if he really believed what he was telling me. The overhead system announced a train destined for Washington, D.C. was boarding on track 12. Leonard tried to take a step away from our conversation, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I said. I winced because I knew how this was going to sound. "What's the deal with the closets?" Leonard stopped moving but didn't turn back to face me fully. "There's a few pictures of them in the documentation," I continued. "One of the women I found in the warehouse made me check one." "You opened it?" he asked. "Yeah, there was nothing inside, just hangers and a box." Leonard shook his head and pulled his arm free from my grip. "Then you got lucky," he said. "Or I don't know. I don't know how it works." The announcement system called out Washington train again. Leonard adjusted his backpack. "Look," he said suddenly, his voice harder than before. "I wasn't going to say any of this because I didn't think you'd take it serious if I did. But I don't really care if you do now." He shifted the backpack on his shoulders again and finally looked directly at me. "I think people are being used as offerings. What they actually do with them or what happens to them, I don't really know. But I think it's to appease someone or something." I opened my mouth to respond, but Leonard kept talking. "I saw one of them once, in a closet. Well, I don't know what I saw, but I saw something." The crowd streamed past us towards the platforms, and the announcement system called out the final boarding for Washington, D.C. on track 12. "I need to go," Leonard said. "I can't protect you if you leave." He stopped for a moment and turned back to me. His hair cut the light above, and his eyes looked hollow. "I don't think you can protect me, even if I stay." I watched him walk towards the platform and disappear into the crowd of commuters heading south.
Robertson deals, and it's low and away, ball 2. He's really working the outside corner here, trying to get Martinez to chase. Count goes to 2-1. Hughes is up and throwing in the bullpen now. You can see him out there in left field. He threw 3 scoreless innings in Anaheim just 2 nights ago. Robertson back on the rubber. Here's the pitch. Swing and a miss. Caught him with the off-speed off the plate. 2-2 now. 53,000 strong here at Yankee Stadium on their feet. Robertson trying to put this one away. Hold on, there are some fans that are making their way onto the field. There's a group of at least 30 of them that have made it past security. It looks like they are trying to form a circle around Pena in left field. I'm not sure what we are watching here. It looks like it might be some kind of a protest. Security is really struggling to get these fans off the field. This is out of control. It looks like they are trying to perform some kind of ritual or something. The lights have just flickered here in the stadium. I think we need to get the camera off of this group. Pena has just disappeared. I don't see him anywhere on the field. He was inside the circle of fans, and suddenly he was just gone. He is not on the field. I have no idea what is happening right now. But there is a serious situation going on here on the field. Rodrigo Pena was inside the circle of protesters, and now he is not there. The group is starting to disperse here, running back into the stands, it looks like. The players have left the field, and the police are on the field right now, but this is just pandemonium. Unless my brain is tricking me right now, we have just watched a man disappear in front of our eyes.
I watched the arrest list grow through the night at the 44th Precinct as stadium security and NYPD brought them in one by one. Out of the 32 people who'd formed that circle around Pena, 25 were caught before they could slip away into the streets of New York. Most were being held in holding cells downstairs, waiting for processing and federal interviews. The case that had been mine alone for months suddenly belonged to everyone. Apparently, at least 4 of the people detained had names linked to the last assembly in our database, which was almost half of all the names in the database. Agents I'd never spoken to were pulling files and making calls about the group. Terrorism task force guys who ignored me in the hallways were suddenly asking me questions about the documentation and recruitment patterns. Even the assistant director called down from DC, wanting to know what we knew about the group's culture and structure, and whether the cells were operating in other cities. Overnight, I had suddenly become one of the most important agents in the city. I stood outside interview room 3 with an NYPD detective, a uniformed police officer, and Lawrence Roman. I'd never spoken to him directly before that night. He kept his arms crossed and his expression unreadable while the detective briefed us on what they had so far. The detective said they'd pulled a woman from the group who seemed most willing to talk for now. She'd waived her rights without hesitation and hadn't asked for a lawyer. Roman asked if we'd identified her yet, and the uniformed officer flipped through the papers on his clipboard. He rattled off a name I didn't recognize and an address in Queens. She had no priors and no connections to any known extremist groups. She worked as an admin assistant at a non-profit in Midtown. The detective gestured towards the door with his thumb and said she'd been sitting in there for 20 minutes now. The detective said she needed to be in the room with me for legal purposes, and I just nodded. I hesitated for a moment and then looked to Roman. Some of the questions I ask might sound irrelevant or ridiculous, but based on what I've learned through my informant and what happened at the stadium, I think they're necessary. Roman stared at me for a long moment with his arms still crossed. His expression hadn't changed since I'd arrived. He glanced towards the window where we could see the woman through the one-way glass. "Nothing you could say can be crazier than what I saw in that stadium," he said quietly. I accepted this as the only advice I was going to get from him. I nodded at the detective and she pushed the door open to the interview room. Inside, the woman looked younger than she had from the other side. Her long brown hair was worn up in a ponytail fashion and she sat hunched forward with her hands folded on the table. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. The detective stood near the door. "Hello, I'm Agent Gordon. This is Detective Holliver," I said, gesturing towards the detective. "Where's your name?" I asked, unclicking my pen for effect. The woman looked up at me. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying, but her face was dry. "Kristen Cyrus," she said flatly. I wrote her name down, even though I already had it. "What were you doing at the stadium last night?" I asked. Kristen stared past me at the wall behind my shoulder. She seemed to be thinking about the question, but I sensed she was thinking about something else entirely. "I was there to perform my responsibility," she said finally. I nodded and leaned forward slightly. "Your responsibility to who?" "Everyone," she said without hesitation. I let out a long breath through my nose, not realizing I'd been holding it. "Are you a part of a group called the Last Assembly?" I asked. "Yes," she said matter-of-factly. "What is your role in this group?" She contemplated only for a second. "I am simply a member of the congregation." "Okay," I said, placing my pen down. "Where is Rodrigo Pena right now?" "I don't know who that is," Kristen replied. For some reason, I believed her in that moment. Her answer seemed genuine, like the name meant nothing to her. "He was the man standing in left field last night when you formed a circle around him," I explained. Kristen's eyes widened slightly and she sat up straighter in her chair. "Oh," she said quietly. I see. She looked down at her folded hands on the table. I didn't know his name. We didn't need to know his name. What do you mean you didn't need to know his name? Kristen shook her head slowly and her ponytail swayed across her shoulders. Who the person was didn't matter, she said. At least we didn't think it mattered. All that mattered was how many people were watching. I hope. I tried to get her to clarify. All that mattered for what? Kristen didn't answer. She just kept staring down like the question had disappointed her. I leaned forward across the table. Where is Rodrigo Pena right now? She shrugged her shoulders without looking up. I don't know. I glanced back at the one-way glass, knowing Roman was watching. When I turned back to Kristen, I kept my voice level. What you were doing at the stadium was a ritual, an offering, or maybe a sacrifice of sorts, correct? She looked at me like I'd finally asked a meaningful question. I leaned back and folded my arms across my chest. You guys took Natalie Phillips, but that didn't work though, right? Then you tried the ritual at the stadium because you thought you needed witnesses for your act? She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her putting it together. She was realizing I already knew more than she thought. Kristen didn't nod, but the look she gave me was enough to concede that I was correct. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the documentation, setting it on the table between us. Most of the country just watched a man disappear on television, I said. Millions of people saw what you did at the stadium. You were part of that act. Nothing is going to be the same after this. I agree, she said, locking eyes with me. Nothing will be the same. But it is you who doesn't understand the gravity of the situation, Agent Gordon. Then help me understand, I said. Kristen hesitated. Her hands unfolded on the table and she looked down at them like they belonged to someone else. She opened her mouth for a second, but didn't speak. There's a fear, she said finally. Her voice had dropped to almost a whisper. That if too many people know about their existence, we won't be able to appease them anymore. We won't be able to control them. I raised an eyebrow. Control who? Kristen shook her head quickly. We don't name them. We don't talk about them directly. We think that is part of the reason this is all falling apart right now. I slid my pen and notepad across the table toward Kristen. Draw them then. She stared down at the blank paper for a long moment as she leaned over the table. I watched her weigh the morality of drawing whatever it was against the code she lived by in her head. Kristen's hand finally lowered to the pen and picked it up. She pulled the notepad closer and angled it away from me so I couldn't see what she was drawing. Her ponytail fell across her shoulder as she leaned over the paper. She drew for several minutes in intense concentration. Her hand moved across the page in slow, deliberate strokes. Every 30 seconds or so, she would stop and examine what she had drawn. I made no attempt to stop her. I could imagine Roman and whoever else was watching through the glass throwing a fit, but I no longer cared. After the events of the previous night, the rules that had governed my work and my life for years felt meaningless. After several minutes, Kristen's hand, now dirtied with ink stains, finally went still. She stared down at what she'd drawn for a long moment before slowly pushing the notepad back across the table towards me. I pulled the notepad the rest of the way towards myself while glancing back at the detective. I left it on the table and stared down at what Kristen had drawn. The detail was unbelievable. It depicted a closet inside of a home. The wall around it was incredibly detailed as well, with a framed picture and a thermostat rendered in careful pen strokes. The closet itself was very dark, with only a few hangers visible in the foreground, like she shaded them lighter on purpose. But in the back of the closet stood a figure. The shape was almost human and impossibly dark with eyes that illuminated the surrounding darkness. The figure wore a large, rounded hood that seemed like it was almost part of its body. I stared at the drawing, and the figure's eyes seemed to follow me, even though they were just marks on a paper. Kristen sat watching me with her hands folded on the table again. I looked up at her finally and made a gesture to her work of art. Well, did it work? Kristen's expression shifted slightly, like she needed me to clarify something obvious. Did our offering work? She asked. Yeah. Was it a success? She shook her head slowly. I don't know, she said. I really don't know. I raised my eyebrows casually. Well, how do we find out? Kristen didn't answer right away. Then she slowly lifted one hand from the table and pointed down at the drawing between us. I stared down at it and then slumped in my chair a bit to stare at the ceiling. All right, I said, quickly standing up. I turned towards Detective Oliver and told her to stay there. I walked out of the interview room and Roman was immediately in my face, asking me what the hell I was doing. I moved past him down the hallway without responding. The first door I tried was locked. The second door opened into a small break room. An empty coffee pot sat on the counter with a table and metal chairs in the center. And in the corner, against the wall, was exactly what I was looking for. I turned and walked back down the hallway towards the interview room. Roman was still standing outside with his arms crossed, watching me like I'd lost my mind. I pushed the door open and looked at Kristen, still sitting at the table. Get up, I said. Detective Oliver stepped forward from her position near the wall. Whoa, hold on. It's fine, I said, without looking at her. I kept my eyes on Kristen. We're just going down the hall. Kristen was still seated when I told her to get up again. She looked terrified, like she knew exactly what I was going to make her do, but she still stood up anyway. I led her out of the interview room and heard multiple voices behind me trying to stop us, but I just kept walking her down the hallway towards the break room. Roman and 2 other agents I didn't recognize followed us inside, asking us what we were doing. I ignored them and walked Kristen straight to the closet in the corner. She stopped about 3 feet from it, and her whole body went rigid like she'd hit an invisible wall. Open it, I said sternly. Kristen looked back at me with a serious expression and stood there frozen. Time to find out if it worked. She finally reached for the closet door. Only then did I notice she was still holding the pen she used to draw this very scenario. Before the door was even fully open, her body jolted like she'd been electrocuted. Her eyes went wide and wild, and she took a step back from the closet. She jabbed the pen straight into her neck. Blood sprayed across the break room wall. Several agents jumped on her immediately, trying to wrestle the pen from her. I stood there detached and watching everything in slow motion as blood pooled on the floor around my feet. The closet door hung open about halfway. The lights from the break room should have illuminated everything inside, but they didn't. The darkness stretched back endlessly, like I was staring into a tunnel with no end. But the darkness was not vacant.
Good evening. I'm Linda Walters, and we are following a rapidly developing situation across the tri-state area. State and federal authorities are issuing an urgent public safety advisory effective immediately. Residents are being instructed not to enter closets, storage spaces, or enclosed wardrobe areas within their homes. This includes bedroom closets, hallway storage, utility closets, and any confined interior spaces not currently occupied. Officials are stressing that this is not a drill. Law enforcement sources confirm that emergency services have received a significant spike in distress calls over the last 40 minutes, many of them originating from inside private residences. Details remain limited, but authorities say the calls share consistent and concerning similarities. If you are currently inside a closet or enclosed storage space, officials advise you to leave the area calmly and immediately, if it is safe to do so. If you hear noises, movement, or breathing coming from inside a closet, do not investigate. Do not open the door. Leave the room and contact emergency services. Again, the directive from authorities is clear. Do not go into your closets. Do not open them. We are told a joint statement from the Department of Homeland Security and the New York Police Department is expected shortly. Until then, residents are urged to remain in open, well-lit areas and stay with other people if possible. We will continue to bring you updates as this situation develops.